Imagine this, you wake up one morning, and the world is holding its breath. For 13 terrifying days in October 1962, that wasn't a metaphor. It was reality. Humanity stood on the very precipice of nuclear extinction, closer than we had ever been before, or have ever been since. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 13 days the world stood still. The Cold War was at its icy peak. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers with diametrically opposed ideologies, were locked in a global struggle for dominance. Both sides had amassed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, a flimsy defense against an atomic blast. The fear was real, a constant, low-humming anxiety in the back of everyone's mind. And then, on October 14, 1962, that fear was about to become a full-blown nightmare. An American U-2 spy plane, flying high over the lush island of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, took a series of photographs. When intelligence analysts developed the film, their blood ran cold. The images revealed undeniable evidence of Soviet medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missile sites under construction. These weren't just any weapons. These were nuclear missiles, capable of striking major American cities like Washington, D.C., New York, and Los Angeles within minutes. The game had changed. The threat was no longer thousands of miles away across an ocean, it was now at America's doorstep. The news hit the White House like a thunderbolt. President John F. Kennedy was presented with an impossible choice. His military advisors, the Hawks, pushed for an immediate, decisive airstrike on the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They argued that anything less would be seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation for further Soviet aggression. But Kennedy knew the catastrophic risk. An attack on Soviet personnel in Cuba would almost certainly trigger a retaliatory strike, leading to a full-scale nuclear war. Millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, would die in the initial exchange. Civilization as we know it would cease to exist. On the other side were the Doves, who advocated for a diplomatic solution. But could he afford to be patient? Every day that passed, the missiles in Cuba became closer to being operational. The clock was ticking, loudly. Kennedy was trapped. Do nothing, and America lives under the shadow of a Soviet nuclear gun. Attack, and you potentially end the world. For days, behind closed doors, his team, known as XCOM, debated fiercely. The fate of the planet rested on the shoulders of one man, and the counsel he chose to heed. After days of agonizing deliberation, Kennedy chose a middle path, a move that was both firm and yet left room for de-escalation. On October 22, he went on television and revealed the crisis to a terrified American public. He announced that the United States would be implementing a naval quarantine around Cuba. He chose the word quarantine carefully over blockade, as a blockade is technically an act of war. This naval ring would stop any Soviet ships carrying offensive weapons from reaching the island. It was a line in the sand. Kennedy's message to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was clear: remove the missiles, or face the consequences. The world watched, paralyzed with fear. The U.S. military went to DEFCON 3, and then, for the only confirmed time in history, to DEFCON 2, the step right before all-out nuclear war. B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons were in the air 24/7. An armada of U.S. warships steamed towards Cuba to enforce the quarantine line. Soviet freighters, likely carrying more military equipment, were also steaming towards that same line. It was the ultimate game of chicken, played with the lives of every person on Earth. Would the Soviet ships stop, or would they try to run the blockade, forcing the U.S. Navy to fire the first shot of World War III? The tension was unbearable. Secret back-channel negotiations began between Washington and Moscow. Letters, both public and private, were exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev. One moment, Khrushchev would sound conciliatory, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. The next, he would send a more belligerent message, adding a demand for the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The situation was chaotic, confusing, and dangerously volatile. Then, things got even worse. On October 27th, a day that would later be called Black Saturday, a U.S. spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. The hawks in the White House screamed for retaliation. The pressure on Kennedy to authorize an attack was immense. It seemed like the diplomatic path was closing, and the march to war was becoming inevitable. But at the same time, an even more terrifying drama was unfolding, hidden beneath the waves of the Atlantic. An American destroyer, enforcing the quarantine, dropped practice depth charges on a Soviet B-59 submarine, trying to force it to surface. The Americans didn't know this submarine was armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Down in the sweltering, claustrophobic confines of the B-59, the crew was cut off from Moscow. They hadn't had contact for days. The captain, believing war had already broken out, decided to launch their nuclear torpedo. Such a launch required the agreement of 3 senior officers. The captain and the political officer both consented. The world was one yes away from apocalypse. But the third officer, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued against the launch, calming the captain and insisting they surface to await orders. In that moment, with unimaginable pressure upon him, Arkhipov single-handedly prevented a nuclear exchange that would have certainly escalated into global thermonuclear war. His name is not famous, but he is arguably one of the greatest heroes in human history. The world had come within a single man's decision of ending. Back in Washington, Kennedy made a critical choice. He decided to ignore the Hawks' cries for revenge for the downed Judah plane. He also chose to ignore Khrushchev's second, more demanding letter, and responded only to the first, more reasonable one. He publicly accepted the offer. The Soviets would remove the missiles under UN supervision, in exchange for a U.S. guarantee not to invade Cuba. Secretly, his brother Attorney General Robert Kennedy met with the Soviet ambassador and delivered an additional promise: the U.S. would indeed remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but it had to be done quietly sometime later so it wouldn't look like a trade. The next morning, the world woke to astonishing news. Radio Moscow announced that the Soviet Union had accepted the terms. The missiles would be dismantled. The Soviet ships turned back from the quarantine line. Across the globe, a collective sigh of relief was breathed. The immediate crisis was over. The doomsday clock, which had been at 1 minute to midnight, was slowly, carefully, wound back. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a searing, terrifying lesson. It showed just how easily miscalculation, miscommunication, and brinksmanship could lead to unimaginable catastrophe. But it also showed something else. It showed that even in the darkest of times, when fear and paranoia reign, reason and diplomacy can prevail. Kennedy and Khrushchev, leaders of two opposing worlds, stared into the abyss together and, recognizing the shared horror of it all, chose to step back. The crisis led to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, a direct communication link to prevent such a dangerous lack of contact from happening again. It was the moment the Cold War began to thaw, ever so slightly. We owe our existence today to the cool heads and brave choices of a few individuals in those 13 days, from John F. Kennedy to Nikita Khrushchev, and especially to the quiet courage of Vasily Arkhipov in the depths of the ocean. It's a stark reminder of the awesome responsibility that comes with power, and a powerful testament to the simple, profound idea that our shared humanity is always more important than our divisions. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as gripping as I did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. See you next time.